In terms of costs, these data centers, well, some of them, if you've heard of the terminology of a hyperscaler data center, that's over 100 megawatts in power demand. That single customer is often many times larger than the utility's current largest industrial customer. And of course, like many, many times larger than their other smaller customers. And so the new injection of demand on the utility's power system requires a ton of new infrastructure investment. It might even be distribution level, but certainly transmission level and generation level.
Hey, Jeannie.
Yeah, Brew.
Who's our guest on the Energy Nerd Show today?
Today we have Caroline Palmer from Synapse.
Hey,
Caroline.
Hi.
Welcome.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so some of our listeners already know all about Synapse, so I would love to dig right in to this giant question of these giant data centers. What the heck? Tell us what you've been working on.
Well, for the last several months, clients have been coming to Synapse from around the country looking for support in regulatory proceedings in which utilities have proposed to offer data centers electric rates that are pretty complicated and very interesting to consumer advocates and environmental advocates, given the magnitude of data center load, the unprecedented pace of their growth. And I'm specialized in utility rate design and cost of service, or how a utility divides its costs among the customer classes that it serves. So I've been digging right into how much are these data centers going to cost the utilities, how much should they be responsible for that cost, and how should their rates be structured so that they pay the cost?
Mm-hmm. Big questions. Are you finding that the answers that you're finding vary by location, or are there a lot of things that are consistent no matter
General
where?
principles.
Yeah.
There are definitely lessons that can be passed on from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The specifics really vary. I mean, as with so many aspects of the electric sector, depending on whether we're in a vertically integrated market or a deregulated market. So some of those things would really change the dynamics. But in general, the large size of these new data centers is pretty disruptive all over. And therefore, lessons can be transferred, which is what a consultant does.
And are the people coming to Synapse to ask these questions, are they consumer protection nonprofits and agencies? Are they states? Are they municipalities?
Environmental groups.
Yeah.
Environmental groups, yes, which I'm a little bit not surprised by, but it is a little bit unexpected to me. Most of my work is with public interest clients that tend to be consumer advocates first and foremost. But Synapse is seeing a lot of interest from environmental groups, Sierra Club specifically in our case, partnered with several others, Earth Justice and many, who are equally concerned, I would say, with affordability and consumer protection as they are with, the potential damage to achieving environmental goals and, the kind of bread and butter that you would assume for an environmental group. But they're funding me to really focus on how to protect consumers against the data center load and cost.
And so what are the kind of big costs or risks or potential impacts for the grid and for consumers?
In terms of costs, these data centers are, well, some of them, if you've heard of the terminology of a hyperscaler data center, that's over 100 megawatts in power demand. So, that single customer is often many times larger than the utility's current largest industrial customer. And of course, like many, many times larger than their other smaller customers. And so the new injection of demand on the utility's power system requires a ton of new infrastructure investment. It might even be distribution level, but certainly transmission level and generation level. And around the country, utilities do things differently, but some might own that transmission and generation themselves. and we'll need to build it. Markets like MISO, for example, will need to build that transmission in the middle of the country and then assign the costs to the utility. And basically, those costs are massive. I'm working in Michigan right now where Consumers Energy has proposed a data center tariff that would apply, to these new large load customers, where 2024 peak demand, so, the entire power draw on their system at its highest moment in 2024 was 7.5 gigawatts. And Consumers says that they have 15 gigawatts of demand from data centers in their pipeline. Now, data centers might
So
be...
did I get that? That's a tripling of their load, the peak load?
Yes, by the time, if that materialized, it would triple their peak demand, which sounds like a lot of infrastructure to me. I don't think 15 gigawatts will materialize because data centers are shopping around the entire country trying to find out who can meet their need and also who's got the best price to meet the need. But Consumers thinks it could still be 2.65 gigawatts, which is a third of their peak demand. Still a lot of infrastructure and cost.
Right. And can you say how those transmission lines normally get built and how those costs are shared or recovered normally?
Yes. So let's just say in a market setting or where you're served by a regional transmission operator like an RTO, there's a long planning process for transmission permitting and approval, and it will be very costly to install the new transmission, pretty slow, I think. And then that RTO will assign the cost that it attributes to, let's say, Consumers Energy in Michigan, to the utility, and the utility will then assign the cost of that transmission to their customers. And they use formulas for allocating costs that supposedly, represent the way the customers on the system use the system and will assign those who use the system more costs. But those are not necessarily really representing the impact of the data center load, for example. I work a little more in generation costs, so that's the one I can talk to you even more about than the transmission.
So what about principles or practice in allocating generation costs? How does that work? How should it work in this case? Or what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, this is very impactful. So the jurisdictions I'm working in, I mentioned Michigan. I'm also working in Kansas, where Evergy has proposed a similar set of tariffs and pricing. These utilities own their own generation for the most part. They can also buy on MISO, but they therefore need to make an investment decision through their integrated resource planning or IRP process, and they'll look at demand as a whole on the power system and decide what they need to build to meet it. So they don't isolate what's the cost of the data center that's coming, even though that data center or the set of data centers are so large. I think they could be isolated, run an IRP with and without the data center and determine what's that incremental generation cost just to serve these large customers. But the utilities do not want to do that. They say the system is a shared resource, so they'll just find out what they need to build to serve these customers, build it, and then they use a process called their cost of service study to assign those costs among the customer classes.
So it sounds like it starts off pretty bad, and that is if the data center gets built and runs for 30 years. What happens if in 5 years the efficiency of these things makes them require a lot less energy, or they go under? What would happen in that case?
This is definitely on everyone's mind. The utilities seem very plugged into that risk, and that's the point mostly of these proceedings that I'm working in Michigan and Kansas, and they're everywhere, or very many states in the middle of the country at least. And so they've got special provisions built into their tariff design that most other customers don't have in their rate agreements, that try to protect against that risk, the risk of just departed load if the customer goes bankrupt, or significantly reduced load if economic downturn, or in the case of cryptocurrency, they mine when the value is high for Bitcoin, and they can shut right down if not. So you could have very, fluctuating demand in that way too. So the utilities are proposing to build in provisions like a contract term. 15 years is pretty long. There's 8 years, 12 years in Indiana, Michigan's recently approved settlement, where the customer has to sign on to be a customer under this rate plan for 12 years. The rates will change, evolve over time, but there are penalties if the customer leaves before the end of the term, or if they significantly reduce their load during the term.
It's easy to see if they reduce their load, they're remaining as a customer, that maybe they can be held to their contractual terms. But in the case of bankruptcy, that's going to be really hard to enforce.
Right. And that's why another of the provisions is a collateral or financial security piece. They're proposing, I think I'm seeing like 2 years of payments, upfront from these customers, and letters of credit from their parent institution if they have one. Or interestingly, they're like differentiating those financial security terms based on how established the company is. If you have a large parent company like Meta or Amazon, the bond rating is very high. And so those are not held to the same standard as other types of data center customers who have to put up a lot of collateral.
Not a very even playing field.
No.
So it seems like there's with data centers wanting power supply and wanting to get operating quickly, that there ought to be opportunities to figure out ways to do that in the public interest, where they pay their fair share of the costs and get sited and operating on a reasonable time scale. Kind of if everyone works together and is kind of reasonable about all the important outcomes.
Yeah, I think so. You're kind of saying that maybe this could all work out if if everyone was cooperating and thinking of all the risks. And maybe that's true. I think that the interests at play are obviously sit at different sides of the table. And so the data center customers don't want such rigorous protections imposed on them. They think that they're being unfairly, treated with higher pricing than other customers. And generally, they deny that they have higher risk profile than any other large customer. So they're fighting tooth and nail against the consumer protections that I mentioned. And then I have some fundamental disagreement with the premise that utilities are operating under, which is that if they put these protections in place against the risk that the data center leaves, then we're all good. As long as we've protected against the departure risk, the flight risk, then the rest of the power system works itself out because it's
but there
equitable.
But there are other costs and risks that besides that one.
Yeah, I'm very concerned about the risks, even if the data center load does materialize and stays on board, and there's no
and maybe
collateral.
grows and doubles again 5 years from
Well,
now.
yeah, I'm definitely concerned about that too.
Mhm.
But the reason I'm worried about that is I mentioned before these cost of service studies that utilities use to identify which customer classes caused which costs on their power system. And it's very contentious and very subjective. A shared power system, a shared transmission line, or generation resource, distribution substation serves a lot of customers. So how do you say who is responsible? And that dictates the prices that everyone pays. So if a new generation resource is built for the data centers, because they came along, load growth otherwise wouldn't have been like that in this jurisdiction. I think that it could be reasonable to try to assign those costs to the data center specifically. But right now, the cost of that new generation would flow through the cost of service study, which has some subjective and biased methods, I believe, for assigning those costs to the customer classes. So a lot of those costs will end up on the residential class, the small and commercial class, and some on the data center class.
It seems like traditionally the way that's been worked out is like at PUCs, so with the utility commission, and they hear testimony from the utilities witnesses and the different intervener witnesses, industrial customers, maybe the consumer advocate and the others, and that that's the best process we have for getting good good arguments. Nerds sharpen up their pencils and go in there and argue the merits of different methods, right? And which are fair and which are efficient, and which and so there's a lot of work to do. That's part of what I'm saying.
Yes, that's exactly what I do, and it is a lot of work, and it's expensive for our clients. The consumer advocates are the ones that are reliably going to represent the residential interests in these cases. And I work on behalf of consumer advocates around the country on exactly this. And I'm usually up against like the most opposing positions that I face come from the utility itself, which has an incentive to appeal to the large customers. Not even before data centers, just commercial and industrial customers, and then from the industry itself. So I'm seeing Walmart in almost every docket, for example. I'm expecting to start seeing Google and the data center coalition in rate cases more and more, because it will really impact their power prices, the way that these cost allocations are set. But it's a slow process. Consumer advocates are spread pretty thin because that's the same place we talk about revenue requirement and rate base and cost of capital. So
yeah, I feel like two of the things that are really in the utilities skill set, like right in their wheelhouse, is like raising rates and whining about stranded costs. And so they're really good at those things, right?
Yes, and both of those are at play here. Yes, yep, they always need to spend more, especially now. It's always going to be the time of more spending, and right, lots of conditions can lead to stranded costs, like a departed data center.
If there are like extra costs involved in serving big chunky load, like big increments of load, or a load that comes on the system quickly, like the rate of new load, then could that justify a separate rate class for which those costs could be allocated?
Oh, definitely. I think that these customers should be a separate rate class, although they are fighting that in places like Michigan. But even still, if you make them a separate rate class and the utility uses its traditional cost of service methods, which will say whatever each rate class's consumption was during the peak hour on the system, maybe the 12 peak hours on the system during the test year, then that's the cost they're responsible for. And that's flawed because all of the costs of the power generation are pooled together. So even if more expensive baseload power was built to serve the data center classes, all the customer classes will pay an average of all the demand cost that then gets assigned to them based on their peak. So the data centers won't actually be proportionally assigned their baseload costs. They'll be assigned the average demand on the system.
So that could be a situation where the traditional or the method of doing the cost allocation doesn't reflect the aspirational principles of rate design and cost allocation. So allocating costs appropriately based on causation.
Right, exactly. That's a direct example of where the current cost allocation process, in my mind, doesn't reflect cost causation, which is our guiding principle of cost allocation. Is who caused the costs, they should be responsible.
Pay their fair share.
Yeah. But a separate rate class is a good start. I agree.
So I always think that any huge problem has opportunity in it, right? I feel like there could be some big things that had been hoped for, with renewables being maybe faster to site and maybe or maybe not as economic, but maybe if you consider environmental impacts, they would be. And then some, when the public is active and knows that they're at risk of having some big impacts, then concessions can be made. Like if the utility or the developer knows that they're going to have to fight for the right to build these big things, and are there opportunities here that could, even if they're low probability, that we could kind of push for?
That's a nice spin, because I'm usually just on the defensive, on the utility proposals, thinking about the challenges more than the opportunities. I think that, to your point of maybe accelerating clean energy development in general, that's going to go by the wayside as utilities are just trying to ramp up production very quickly to serve these customers. But I know that some of the large new, hyperscale data center institutions like Google have pretty rigorous clean energy expectations for themselves and goals. I think they even want to do some kind of like 24/7 matching with their load shape to their clean resources. And so they're coming into jurisdictions demanding clean energy tariffs be available to them and trying to think creatively about how they and the utility can meet their goals. Often they're maybe even working faster than the utility and wanting things that the utility doesn't want to provide, like locating their own clean resources on site, which is kind of like procuring, like self-procuring power. Actually, in Kansas, where Evergy has this proposal, they'll allow the customer to bring their own capacity, but the customer has to sell that capacity to the utility. Mostly, a utility doesn't want monopoly competition. They want to be the only provider of power. So Google can come and build renewables, but then needs to sell the renewables to Evergy to then sell the power back to Google.
So there's an opportunity, right? The regulation is screwed up. And so if some big player like Google has an idea that is actually better for people and maybe better for the environment, maybe this is a chance to change things.
Maybe, though. That would be a really interesting change. The monopoly compromise
Right.
disrupted.
There are a lot of people who want that already.
Yeah, maybe a slippery slope.
For sure.
Could be great.
Yeah. So what can Synapse do in terms of expanding the sort of places that we can help consumer advocates? I mean, if you're learning something in Kansas, it ought to be applicable other places. Back to the process of kind of pushing back. These data centers aren't limited to a few states. I mean, it feels like they're applying everywhere.
Yes, they definitely are. I think the role that I'm really excited about for Synapse and for myself as, tackling one part of this data center puzzle. We have other Synapsters who are in the weeds in the proceedings about exactly what type of gas generation a utility is proposing to build to meet that demand. That's a whole separate, category of expertise. But in the rate design and consumer protection category, I'm really hoping to land on some solutions that might upend traditional cost allocation and our traditional methods for assigning customer classes their costs, because this new load is so large, risky, and sudden. So I think that probably Synapse's best offering is thought leadership on how does this paradigm shift enable us to shift how utilities, treat costs. But that's a big mountain to climb. No one wants to see cost assignment change. So we'll see how far I get.
Well, maybe some people do.
Well, right. You're right.
Yeah.
Some of us do.
Are there things that the new loads can do? Like we've talked on this show some about like flexibility and demand flexibility, and yeah, I'm wondering like how can that affect the cost if a new load is flexible and can reduce for peak hours or things like that? Can that help with the imposition of costs on the system, and might that be reflected in the rates and cost allocation?
Yes, definitely. That could have a big difference if these data centers can time load reductions to the periods of peak, constraint on the power system. Then it really could avoid meaningful costs. It could mean the difference in building a new peaker plant or a new, congested transmission line, new substation. The incentives to, incentivize the customers to peak shave at the right time have to be well designed. And where I'm working in consumers energy territory in Michigan, they have an interruptible rate or a rider on their large power rate.
So that would be for any kind of factory or a big customer can be in
Exactly.
that, right?
Those customers already belong on the rate. And it's not event based. So they just get a discount essentially on their power price for belonging on that rate without necessarily doing anything. And my understanding is that the utility never calls events. So that's a place where it's kind of just like a special club for the large consumers. That's like the worst case scenario, the kind of pessimistic.
Well, then you don't even know if they're actually interruptible,
Right,
unless you
yeah.
try it out every once in a while and see that it actually works, and then it might be justified to give the rate credits or account for that
Yes.
in the cost allocation. If it's never tested, you don't really even know if it's there.
Mm-hmm.
You don't even know if it's there, and it's definitely not offering any benefit to the power system if they aren't doing anything. But you make a great point about what a good rate design would look like. So in Evergy, Kansas jurisdiction, they have proposed an interruptible tariff or a rider on their large load tariff that is event based. So customers will be paid for the estimated amount that they reduced their demands. So the utility will build a counterfactual. If we hadn't called this event, what would they have consumed? And then what was the value to the utility of the event? And in their tariff, it says that they will call a minimum of one event a year, at least just to test it and prove that the customers can respond. I hope they call more, based on system conditions. But if that's well priced, then it should offer grid benefits and customer benefits. One concern of mine is that the data center customers can then turn on their backup diesel generation and reduce their power draw from the grid, from the utility, and therefore alleviate constraint on the utility system. But they're using pretty polluting diesel backup in most cases.
Shouldn't that be limited by environmental regulation?
I think that it probably should be, but I think even some diesel generation is within the bounds of the Clean Air Act. Maybe it should have a limited number of running hours. It's not an area I'm dug into yet.
Well, okay. Think about the best possible outcome. If there are going to be data centers, what would you like to see happen?
Well, I'd like to see prudent, build out of power system resources. I think the pace of the need is going to require some gas in the near term, given its cost effectiveness right now. But hopefully, an environmentally minded approach to generation, and maybe in partnership with the data centers that want to see clean power, they can assert that they'd like to be served by clean resources. That would be a really nice synergy with the utilities and the data centers for generation, environmental generation. And then I'd like to see an equitable and just and reasonable method for identifying costs that are attributable to data centers and see the utilities actually hold them responsible for those costs and not see the other customers bear the risk and the price.
That'd be good.
Thanks for being on the show, Caroline.
Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, it's been great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.